this video, we're going to be looking at psychological explanations of schizophrenia. So psychological explanations, we've got two. This one we're going to be looking at cognitive explanations, including dysfunctional thought processing, and we'll be looking at two examples of specific dysfunctional thought processing found in patients with schizophrenia. And in our second video, we're going to be looking at family dysfunction, but more on that next time. So when we're talking about cognitive explanations for schizophrenia, what we're saying is that schizophrenia is characterized by disruption to normal mental processes. And we know this because of the cognitive symptoms that occur alongside schizophrenia. Delusions are one example of a cognitive symptom, as is hallucinations. And this suggests that schizophrenia involves impaired cognition and dysfunctional information processing. There is some disruption to the thinking and the mental processes in a person with schizophrenia. So Frith identified two specific kinds of dysfunctional thought processing that's impaired in people with schizophrenia. The first is dysfunction of metarepresentation, and the second is dysfunction of central control. Metarepresentation, I know it's a big fancy word, but if we break it down, it actually is something that you've probably come across before in the course. Metarepresentation means creating a representation of representations. But there's an easier way to think of this. Meta-representation is the ability to reflect on our thoughts and behaviors, which in us, in healthy people, allows us to have insight into our own and other people's intentions and goals. It's basically being able to cognitively monitor one's own thought processes and have self-awareness of one's own intentions. So I'm just going to write this down because I think it's an easier way to think of it. So it's basically being able to think about your feelings, think about your behavioral reactions, which are triggered by your thoughts. So being able to sort of view your own mental states and wishes, and also the intentions and mental states of other people. And this also involves being able to detect cognitive biases or cognitive distortions. So being aware that the way you're seeing the world is actually not accurate. So in healthy people, we're able to reflect on our own thoughts. We're able to reflect on our intentions and understand why we behaved in a particular way, what underlying thoughts were responsible for that action. And we're also able to reflect on this in other people. We're able to see somebody's intention. What were their underlying mental states that made them act in that particular way? People with schizophrenia suffer from meta-representation dysfunction. This means that they have real difficulty recognizing their own thoughts and actions as being carried out by themselves. They're not aware of the thoughts that underlie their behaviors because they're not able to have insight into those underlying intentions and goals. And this can explain really two key symptoms of schizophrenia. One, auditory hallucinations, and two, delusions, particularly delusions like thought insertion. Thought insertion occurs when people believe that their thoughts have been put there by some sort of external source, like from aliens, for example, because they're not able to reflect on their own thinking and their own cognitions and thought processes. So they think that thoughts that arise in their head have been put there from somebody else. And so difficulties with meta-representation or meta-representation dysfunction can explain delusions like thought insertion. It can also explain delusions of persecution, which is where somebody believes that they're being followed or somebody is out to get them. And this is because they have the inability to judge other people's intentions. So if you see somebody doing something, for example, driving behind you in their car, you might accidentally or unintentionally assume hostility and assume that they're following you, because you can't step inside their mental state and understand why they're driving their car. For example, they're just trying to get to work. And so this difficulty with meta-representation means that we're unable to understand our own thoughts and intentions, and we're unable to understand the thoughts and intentions of another person, which might mean that we make mistakes and we attribute hostility to a person when they're not being hostile. You might think that this sounds very similar to theory of mind, and it is. So theory of mind is being able to hold a theory of what's in your mind and also what's in somebody else's mind. And that's probably the closest way of describing meta-representation. Meta-representation can also explain auditory hallucinations. So hallucinations occur because these are really thoughts inside one's own head. That we incorrectly attribute to an external source. And so those voices that somebody hears, they've been created in that person's own mind. But because they lack meta-representation, they're not able to have insight into these thoughts. And so they assume that these thoughts are coming from an outside source, and they're therefore incorrectly heard as auditory hallucinations. It sounds like somebody speaking to them, when really it's actually just the thoughts inside that person's own head. So really important for you to have an accurate definition of meta-representation. I don't want you to refer to it as theory of mind, I just want you to think of it that way. But it's important that you've got an accurate definition of this. So the second type of cognitive dysfunction that occurs in people with schizophrenia is difficulties and dysfunction with central control. Now, central control is the cognitive ability to suppress automatic responses and instead perform deliberate actions. So deliberate actions could be performing in socially acceptable ways. And that's something that we have to deliberately and consciously do, which might mean sometimes that we need to suppress our automatic responses or urges, which could be, for example, yelling or swearing at somebody who's annoying us, for example. We have to suppress those automatic responses and instead behave in a deliberate way. And this can be best demonstrated through the Stroop task. Those of you that have done it will know that the Stroop task requires you to perform two conditions. One, where you read a word. For example, red. And in the second condition, you have to ignore that word and instead read out the colour that the ink is written in. So for this one, actually, the response that we're after is not red, but is blue. And this requires you to suppress the automatic response of reading the word and instead go for the really deliberate response of instead mentioning the ink that the word is written in. And it's really, really hard. It's hard in healthy controls. It is even more difficult for people with schizophrenia because they have issues with this central control, this ability to suppress those automatic responses. And this can lead to serious impairments in goal-directed behavior. If you can't suppress the automatic response to stay in bed today, it means you're not going to perform the deliberate action of going to work. And so it has severe consequences for people with schizophrenia, and it affects their goal-directed behavior, it affects their attention, their memory, it affects a whole range of different behaviors, one of which is disorganized speech. And this is because in all of us, when we're having a conversation, other thoughts and other words are going to pop up into our head, but we're able to suppress those and instead continue with our train of thought. But with people with schizophrenia, they have difficulties and dysfunction in central control. And it means that every word or thought that pops up into their head, they're going to follow those associations. And it means that their speech will often derail. Rather than in us, we've got maybe that thoughts that pop up, but we're able to continue with our train of thought. People with people with schizophrenia are often going to be derailed by these thoughts and words that pop up. There was the example I think I gave you in class a while ago about the woman who had a sister with schizophrenia, and this woman's own name was Julia. And whenever her schizophrenic sister would be talking to her and say her name Julia, she would then just immediately derail the conversation talking about Julia Roberts. And then from Julia Roberts would go talking about another Hollywood celeb and then a film and this and that. And it was because this patient had troubles with central control. All of those, that word Julia was triggering an automatic response and she wasn't able to suppress it. And so that's a really good example of central control difficulties. So it's particularly associated with disorganized speech, but also disorganized behavior. So behaving in unpredictable ways, because that's their automatic response that they're unable to suppress.